Hello and welcome to today's session on modern device management. My name is Emma Rolfe and I am the Modernised Endpoint Lead working for Microsoft here in the UK. So as we get started, what we're going to have a look at, some kind of core fundamentals around modern device management. And actually this question surprisingly comes up a lot, okay? And that is, what is device management? And there's all sorts of very fancy answers that you could give to this question around, policies and configurations and settings. But actually, at its heart, device management is around data, okay? And that kind of lends itself closely into that security component as well. So how am I getting my organizational data onto the device? How am I keeping that data safe? And how am I removing that data if that employee should leave the organization, or perhaps the device has succumbed to something like theft or maybe been misplaced? Okay, so that's kind of what, a very, very high level what device management is. And then we think about, this kind of new term, what is modern management? And modern management, again, is something that we talk a lot around, but no one really quite maybe understands what that kind of framing of the term modern means. So here, from a Microsoft standpoint, when we're talking about modern management, modern means cloud. So from a product perspective, from Microsoft, that would of course be Microsoft Intune. So cloud-based device management, we would refer to as modern management. And that comes with various different benefits, single pane of glass view. You're now able to have the admin center, which can be accessed from anywhere. We'll be having a look through a number of these various different benefits as well as we go through the session today. What we're going to do is we're going to kind of start off around, what are the kind of market challenges that we're seeing around modern device management and what are the factors that are driving the market towards that. We'll have a look at how modern management actually relates through into our modernising endpoints journey and how that corresponds to our zero trust components and messaging here at Microsoft. And then what we're actually going to do at the end is, once we've had a look at Intune versus Configuration Manager, we'll actually have a little bit of a demo. So we'll jump into the Intune admin console, the endpoint management admin center, and we'll have a little look at what it looks like in a real world from a customer standpoint as well. So now we've got the concept of device management and modern management. Let's have a look at a few different terms and where they would sit, in terms of this traditional IT and modern IT. And I think it's good to call out here, kind of this traditional versus modern. Or sometimes with traditional, people might refer to that as legacy. Maybe in some scenarios that could be the correct language and terminology, but if we think of something like Configuration Manager, that is still a very robust system, right? And traditional or on-prem would probably be the better way of framing a technology like that. So we've got some terms here, on the left-hand side. Active Directory, so that's your identity directory solution for customers here at Microsoft. Domain join, it's obviously a term that's been around for a long time, and group policy, etc., etc. The Windows Update Service and imaging as well. And then we look into modern, okay, and actually some of these terms are very similar to what we've seen before. So Active Directory becomes Azure Active Directory. Domain join becomes Azure Active Directory domain join, for instance, right? So it's more of an evolution of our existing product suite that we've already got, to be able to facilitate this kind of move and this new way of working, as a part of that as well. So when you're hearing and speaking and having conversations with customers, listen out for some of these terms, because these are really clear clues around what their landscape could be looking like from an environment perspective and what could potentially be a modernization trigger. Okay, if they're talking around traditional imaging as an example, then that there's an opportunity there to be able to have a conversation with around Intune, or maybe looking at something like autopilot as an evolution of that as well. So we might have a look at some of the challenges that are driving this kind of shift towards modern management as an example. So it's no surprise to anybody. Over the last few years, we've seen this kind of huge shift to this massive kind of remote and hybrid work environments. Okay, we don't no longer really have office environments that are filled with employees that are connected to a network in a traditional way, or maybe the environment used to primarily be desktop PCs that were always plugged in and powered on. Maybe that world has changed, and now we're seeing this big rise to mobile with a significantly remote workforce. How do you manage and deal with the complexities, managing that organization, which has gone from, one or a handful of perimeters to hundreds and thousands of perimeters potentially around the world, and that kind of endpoint diversity, it doesn't just extend from the device itself or where the people are, it's also the applications that are running on those as well. Historically, things like shadow IT could have been a massive challenge or concern for a lot of organizations. We're seeing that more and more on the rise. Again, particularly as devices are at home, people are also using them more and more for personal use. Whereas maybe the organizational owned devices, again, maybe could have been a desktop PC, which is, permanently at a location or an office site. With the devices that are going home, they might be using those in the evening to support, any children they have with homework, as an example. Okay, so it's making sure that you can kind of protect that corporate data on that device that maybe has a dual use as well to support that individual and what they're trying to achieve when they're at home. And ultimately, that comes through into this kind of employee satisfaction. And that's something that we're hearing a lot within the industry. And we're talking about a lot ourselves here at Microsoft around this user experience and user satisfaction, particularly in a market where we're seeing, big challenges around talent and retention, and things like that. How are organizations keeping their staff, and recruitment, and making sure that you're kind of providing that best possible IT experience for users, because ultimately, receiving your IT equipment is the first thing that happens when you join a new employer, right? And when PC is the new office and you don't have a physical location and your connection to your workplace is the device that you're using, providing that excellence in that IT experience is really, really important to make sure that, you've got that kind of digital user experience and employee satisfaction to keep your employees within the organization. And then, of course, cybersecurity, right? You need to ultimately be keeping people safe and the data safe. Okay, the biggest risk to any organization, is its staff, and it's not malicious, it could be human error, and things like that. So it's just making sure that you've kind of got the policies and the settings on those devices to make sure that you're keeping your organization and data safe and also keeping your people safe as well in the process. Let me just have a look at that as a visual. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I quite like this slide because it, as a visual representation of what that, complexity of that environment looks like. It's quite a nice striking way of being able to say, right, okay, crikey, there's a lot of different things going on here that, some of those challenges, which, are kind of remediated or addressed through looking at modern management and our Microsoft Intune technology there, as well as part of that. So let's have a little look at this modernized endpoint journey. And this slide, builds out quite nicely here. And actually, it's kind of this kind of roadmap, this kind of journey that you'll see. And I'm just going to get the pointer out here. So it all starts in identity and access. And I love this slide, particularly if I'm speaking to customers, because it's a really nice way of going, right, okay, where are you on the journey? Where do we put that stake in the ground, and where do we want to get to, and what are the steps that we need to achieve to get there together, okay, as part of that. And also what's interesting about this slide is some customers might not even be on it. They could be what we call dark. Okay, so they might not even have made that first step onto that kind of cloud journey. So, the identity and access over here, there'll be Azure Active Directory, very much around, the identity piece and protecting the person. So multi-factor authentication, as an example, password lists, things like that would sit within this bucket. Okay, so how do we protect the person first and foremost? Then it's how do we protect the data and the files? Okay, and that's then we move on to that kind of next step. And then we get into the interesting component, which is kind of more of the basis of the conversation that we're having today, which is around the actual devices itself. Okay, and these modern devices, as a term, that's when we're thinking about that, we're really thinking around, what are these kind of new foundation level hardware components that are required in devices to be able to keep things safe. So some of you, of course, may be aware, Windows 11 has been announced, and that has hardware requirements. The reason for that sits within this bucket, right? Okay, so that fundamental reason why we have that requirement for a TPM 2.0, as an example, secure boot, okay, that would kind of fall within that modern device terminology, and these hardware components are required, for tangible security reasons to be able to mitigate against threats and bad actors as well from the organization. So, looking at that kind of modern device. And of course, it's not just endpoints, laptops and PCs, HoloLens, Teams meeting rooms, if anyone's not sure what this MTR acronym is here, would fall into this bucket as well. And of course, cross-platform, and we'll have a look at that a little bit later on when we're looking into the Intune standpoint. And then we move through, Windows 11, of course, and then we look at this kind of device management. Okay, so you can see device management, is a key kind of component which is required on this roadmap. And this end destination here is zero trust, and we'll have a look at that zero trust component in a moment. Right, so being able to have that device management to keep those devices secure, again, keep that data secure, as part of that organization is critical to being able to kind of achieve that foundation on zero trust in terms of the pillars that we have as part of that. And then, of course, we go through to slightly more advanced technology. So looking at the update for business, which is probably linked through to the device management one as well. And then looking at, the endpoint security, Defender for endpoint, etc. And then looking into virtualization-based cloud PCs, managed services, etc., etc. So these are more kind of optional. And then you've got the destination there of zero trust. So what is zero trust? And this can be a little bit confusing for people. And I know a lot of vendors talk to zero trust, and there might be different ways that people are kind of viewing this or framing it as an example. So when Microsoft, ourselves, we speak around zero trust, really it kind of falls in these three kind of key terms, right? So we've got verify explicitly. Okay, so making sure the person is who they say they are. That's kind of the most simplistic way of putting that. So, are you who you say you are? Okay. And then we've got use least privilege access. And that will limit access with what we would call just in time and just enough. Okay. So it means that, if you're going to get access to a resource, that we're only going to give you access to the thing that you need. Okay. So we're not going to give you the key to the entire castle, as an example. Think of it more like maybe like a hotel, where you're in a hotel, you just get a key to your room. Okay, you don't get access to the whole hotel, you just get a key to your room, instead of the key to the castle where you can access the whole thing. Okay, and then we've got assume breach. And assume breach in this scenario is actually kind of thinking, well, what's that kind of worst case scenario? And if someone does get in, how do we minimize that blast radius? Okay, right, how do we keep things safe if a bad actor does get access to that organization? And that could be things like encryption, okay, data loss prevention, monitoring, automated detection and response would fall in to this assume breach component. Okay, so we've got these kind of three elements together, and together they are what we call the guiding principles of zero trust. But why is that important for today's conversation around device management? And really it falls in here. Okay, so these are the pillars of zero trust. Okay, and interestingly, most of these actually would fall into the modern mobile device management and modern management component here at Microsoft. Okay, so we've got the endpoints, of course, right? So people need devices to be productive to do their work in most scenarios of the workforce. Okay, and those people that are accessing those devices will obviously need to have an identity. So these two very, very closely linked. The devices have applications that need to be managed. Okay, they need to be connected to some form of infrastructure. You've got a network, perhaps that could be VPN as well, and then again, it comes down to the data and keeping it safe. So when we actually look at all of these pillars of zero trust, we can see that there is a very, very, tangible link back to MDM solutions and Microsoft Intune. Okay, and that's why I'm just giving a quick overview of zero trust, because when we're looking at device management, it goes far beyond just kind of imaging and things like that. Then maybe there could be the misconception of that's what it is, but actually it goes a lot further, in being able to protect organizations against these modern threats that we're seeing in the world today. So let's have a little look now on what this looks like from a technology standpoint. So what we've got here on this particular slide is on the left-hand side here, we have Configuration Manager. And for those of you that have been in the industry for a while, as an example, you may have known it's had a few different names. SCCM is probably still the most, well-known and common terminology for it. So System Centered Configuration Manager, SCCM. I, will put my hands up and say I still fall foul of calling it SCCM, mainly because it's a lot easier to say than Configuration Manager. It can be a little bit of a tongue twister. But actually, the name change to Configuration Manager is even got a longer name change, and that is Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager. So that's MECM, and that's even more of a mouthful of that name change. If you're hearing any of those terms, it relates to what we would frame as kind of like on-premise. Okay, so this is our on-premise technology stack here. And that connects through, and then you've got the Configuration Manager console. So that's where you'd actually be deploying those settings and things like that as well, okay, within that kind of remit. Okay, so this element here, on-premise, maybe you might call it traditional, okay, and that sits there. So that's for most organizations, the starting point, okay, if they've been around for a while. And then we move on to Microsoft Intune on the right-hand side, okay. So Microsoft Intune, as you can see, it's cloud because it's in a nice little cloud bubble there. And then we've got the Intune console as well. So that's what, used to be looking to manage those devices, from that kind of endpoint management layer. And then we brought out this framing and this term, kind of this change to Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And now this slide probably could do with updating, because a few weeks ago, we actually had an announcement that we are changing our messaging. So at Microsoft, we are no longer calling these two technologies under Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Microsoft Endpoint Manager as a product name is no longer going to be used. We are going back to the old naming of just Intune and Configuration Manager, okay, because it was causing confusion. However, Endpoint Manager is still the name of the admin console, okay. So for admin console, yes, Endpoint Manager is the right wording. For the actual technology itself, Endpoint Manager is not. You would refer to it now as Intune or Configuration Manager. But the reason why we've got this kind of link here is, again, because of that kind of name change there for the admin console. So this kind of unified platform is the framing, here, and this is what is actually called as part of the kind of administration portal process. So let's just build this out then in terms of, what workloads are we seeing, and platforms as part of these solutions. Okay, so we build out, first of all, it's the Configuration Manager. Remember, we're on-premise or traditional. And what we're seeing down here is what we'd call on-premise domain joined PCs, or they might be called on-premise managed as an example. Okay, we've got, various different platforms called out here. Hopefully everyone knows which one this one is, and that is Windows. And we've got Mac OS here as well. And then we've got Linux, okay, or Linux, depending on whereabouts you live. And with the Windows, one of the interesting kind of use cases, differentiators for Configuration Manager is that it will manage Windows 7 devices. It will manage Windows Server as well as an example. So actually, Configuration Manager from a Windows standpoint, has a very, very vast portfolio of platforms that it can support, operating systems that it can support, because it can go back further down into our operating system stack, into more what we call like legacy devices that maybe end of support, such as Windows 7. I'm just going to carry on building this whole thing out actually and just start on the Intune. We'll come back to the middle in a moment. So then when we look at the Intune and then the platforms that can manage, which we've got over here. Okay, and we can see that we've got, Windows different form factors, so that's kind of highlighting there. And then we've actually got these other ones in the middle. Okay, so we've got Android, the little bot. We've got iOS, which is mobile phones, iPads would fall into that bucket as well. Windows Mobile, if anyone's got any of those kicking around anymore, and Mac OS as well over here. Right, so you can see that actually when we're looking at the Intune components, that kind of cloud management, we've got more mobile platforms, okay? And what we would call within that technology stack, so we spoke earlier around, what is modern management and mobile device management. Within Intune, there is a technology which we would call MAM, Mobile Application Management, okay? And mobile application management is what you would use. The primary use case of that would be personal owned devices. Okay, so you could use it on organization and corporate owned, but the most common would be, personal owned, employee owned devices, bring your own device scenarios, etc. And what mobile application management does is it effectively keeps the organization and corporate data safe, separate from the personal information, because employees, quite rightly, do not like their employer managing their personal devices. Okay, they don't want them seeing what they're doing. It's their devices. They don't want to run the risk that their employer could potentially wipe all of their own personal data. Okay, that is a risk, and a lot of employees aren't willing to be in that scenario. So what mobile application management will do is it will keep that information safe. So if you've got your personal information on your personal device, your employer can't see or manage or interact with that. But what they can do is the organizational data that they put on that device, they can keep safe and they can control that. So as an example, with Android, you would have a work profile. So you'd have two separate profiles on that device, kind of almost like containerizing that data apart from each other. So as an organization, you can say, well, if I want this person to access emails on their device, I want to make sure that that's safe, and I want to maybe leverage something that they need to have a PIN or biometrics to log in as some form of kind of multi-factor authentication to be able to access that data. But then, as an employee, you're safe in the knowledge that they're not managing your device. They don't have control over your personal components as part of that as well. So it's a very nice kind of middle ground. That technology, is not just mobile phone specific. You can also leverage that on Windows devices as well as a bring your own device scenario. Then we've got this component in the middle, okay, and that's the Windows 11 and 10, okay. So you've got those kind of two that can both manage those together, right? So why have we got this component down here in the middle together, right? And it really comes into what we call this co-management, okay. And this is really what particularly enterprise we speak to a lot with customers at the moment, right? So co-management is connecting the two technologies together to do the best tool for the job. Okay, so perhaps I've got some devices which are already domain joined on-prem. They're 3-4 years old. I want to push an update out to those. They're already within Configuration Manager. Well, then naturally any update or driver update they want to push through to those devices, it would make sense to push that through Configuration Manager, because that's where they've already been managed and that's where they've been managed for a long, long time. Okay. But then say, for example, I've got a 3-month-old device which has been deployed using autopilot, and I want to, roll an update or push an application out to that device as an example. Well, because they're already using modern management, it would make sense just to manage that in Intune. Okay, so code management is, allowing to have that choice, the best tool for the job for your devices. So you upload them all in, single pane of glass across the entire organization, and then being able to pick and choose whether it's Configuration Manager or Intune, depending on the task that you're looking to achieve. And again, that is called co-management. I think co-management is read and write. That's the easy way of thinking about it, read and write. If we want a read-only component, this would be tenant attach. So tenant attach is I want to see all of my devices in Intune, but I don't want to manage them in the cloud. Okay. So a scenario or a use case of that could be that you want to use Intune's reporting, or you might want to be able to have that kind of single pane of glass from a security perspective, but you want to keep managing all of your devices using Configuration Manager. So that would be tenant attach in that particular scenario there. And then we've got this third component here, which is cloud native management, and that's in the scenario where all of your devices are managed in Intune, and we would call that cloud native in that particular scenario. So that could be organizations that are looking to go full cloud or serverless, perhaps, or looking to go cloud native, whatever kind of terminology they're leveraging there. A lot of startups would probably fall in that bucket, organizations that didn't have significant investments in a Configuration Manager setup perhaps would fall within that kind of component as well there. So there are various different use cases, and we are seeing more and more customers that are looking on that journey towards cloud native. That is their destination that they're working towards. And that's where, as partners, you can really help to provide value to your customers as well. We're looking at that kind of journey slide around well, what is your destination? Where do you want to get to? What is your nirvana? And what steps do we need to take to support you in getting there? You know, that could be for, you know, services, migrations, etc., etc., you know, whatever that might be, you know, but being able to demonstrate that value to the customer, you know, to get them to that kind of optimum outcome that they're looking to achieve. And that destination will probably change, you know, periodically, all the time, right? You know, as needs and things evolve, technology changes, you know, that destination will probably continue to change as well. You know, that's why it's important to kind of keep that cadence and that relationship with the customer, you know, to make sure that, you know, those kind of needs are being met and addressed as well. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to finish off there in terms of any PowerPoint slides. And we're just going to quickly jump into a demo environment, just as we're going to close off kind of the last sort of 10 minutes of this webinar and recording as well for you. So I'm just going to quickly open up and share my demo environments. So hopefully we can see that coming up on everybody's screens. I'm just going to wait one moment just to make sure that it's definitely sharing. Okay, fantastic, excellent. So for those of you that aren't aware or haven't seen this before, this is Intune. Okay, this is what Intune looks like. This is our endpoint manager admin center that we can see up across the top there. Remember, I was speaking before, endpoint manager is the name of the admin center, but in terms of referring it to a technology, endpoint manager, we're going to be dropping that. Okay, so it's going to move Microsoft Intune again. Endpoint manager is the admin console. Okay. So here we can see we're actually greeted through from the dashboard view, and quite, you know, visually and clearly we can kind of see, you know, what is the current landscape and state of our device environment. So if I had any devices that weren't in compliance, that would flag red. It would show me how many devices were out of compliance. I could click onto that. It would tell me why. Perhaps a Windows update hadn't been run on them, as an example, or they hadn't been turned on for a certain period of time. That might flag as, you know, a non-compliant device in that particular scenario. And then we can look, you know, what is our service health, etc., etc. as well. You know, so it's just a very nice visual way of being able to see, you know, is there anything that really needs my attention straight away. And then we're also greeting, you know, with kind of some news, what announcements and things we've got. So it's always worthwhile having a little look down here to see if there's anything new that's popped up as part of that. So what we're going to have a look at here is devices. So you can see I've got my demo environment is, you know, very, very large. My grand total of 2 Windows devices that I've got in this demo environment. For the purpose of what we're looking to achieve today, that's absolutely sufficient. Okay, so click on the overview, and we kind of again see that kind of breakdown of the organization in terms of platforms. What we're going to have a look at here is we're going to have a look at the enrolled devices first and foremost. So when we're looking at the enrolled devices here from a Windows enrollment perspective, right down the bottom, autopilot. And for those of you that want more information on Windows Autopilot, there is a recording that will also be sent out, which is a dedicated session around Windows Autopilot. You know, Westcoast have some fantastic services, you know, white glove services to be able to even, you know, demonstrate additional value to your customer beyond just the normal autopilot service, to actually do some of the heavy lifting of that imaging, cloud imaging in factory as well. So I recommend that you go and have a look at those. But from a customer standpoint, so Westcoast can upload the you know, device IDs and do some kind of configuration and basic settings. But from a customer standpoint, you know, what does that look like? What does the customer see on their Intune portal, right, when they're actually configuring this stuff themselves? So when we go into the autopilot, we'll have a look at the configuration profiles. We've got 2 options here because autopilot also works on HoloLens for those that weren't aware. And then we've got PC. So I'm just going to put test in here, and I'm not going to convert targeted devices for the basis of this. And then we're faced with a number of settings. Okay, we've got deployment modes. Okay, so we've got user driven and self-deploying. User driven means, you know, that someone would log in with credentials to start that deployment. Self-deploying would be used in scenarios where an identity or a user is not linked to a device. Okay, and that might seem a little bit weird to get your head around, but think digital signage, okay, as an example. So Some digital signage and screens will actually run on a Windows operating system, and they need to be managed, right? They still have security and updates and things like that need to be managed, okay? But they're not linked to an individual. Like, someone's not signing in with their username and password. So that's where you would use self-deploying in that particular scenario. There's other scenarios as well, but that's probably one of the easier ones to understand. Then we're looking at, do we want to Azure domain join? So that's kind of native or hybrid. So again, that kind of on-prem and cloud domain join option. And we've got some settings here around license terms, etc., etc. And then we've got some more interesting components here. So, what sort of access do we want the user to have? Do we want them to have admin or standard? What we're actually seeing more and more is organizations is allowing local admin onto devices, because as we're moving towards zero trust, what we're seeing is that user and that data is being kept safe in so many different ways that actually locking down the device and not providing local admin is almost counterintuitive as part of that. Okay, everyone can recall times when you've had to get someone to remote into your device because you want to just download Adobe Reader or something like that, and it's very frustrating that it impacts your productivity by not being able to kind of install things on your device as you need them, and being kind of treated like you had some common sense. But actually, with encryption and various backup, multi-factor authentication, Azure information protection, the list goes on and on, because of all of these different security components that you can kind of put in with your organization. It allows you to kind of relax that rule there, and that's kind of a trend that we're seeing consistently across organizations at the moment. We've got some kind of components here around pre-provisioning. Again, someone I was speaking to Westcoast service before around that white glove and that pre-provisioning, then that would be falling within here. And then we've got some components which are actually quite interesting. So language. Okay, we were speaking earlier around trying to attract talent in organizations. This is a big pain point for customers at the moment. Okay, they're looking to have that recruitment and to retain that staff. And by leveraging some form of zero touch, such as autopilot, if that new employee is joining your organization and that English is not their first language, as an example, you can personalize that device so that when they go through the out-of-box experience, or what we call the UBI, out-of-box experience, you can actually make sure that it's demonstrating the language that's most familiar to them as a nice kind of VIP experience. What you can also do as well is, if the device is going to be assigned to a specific user, and we'll have a look at assignments in a second, if it's going to be assigned to a specific user, you can actually put in their name and it will know their credentials. So when it runs through the autopilot process, and when they first turn on the device, it will recognize the device ID automatically. It will know that device is already associated with a particular user. And then when you're turning the device on, it will say, "Hi, Emma, I'm getting things ready for you." It will already have put in my email address because it knows who I am, and I just need to put in my password. So it's a really nice, again, kind of personalized onboarding experience that you can provide staff, and something that you can configure on behalf of your customers as a service, as a partner as well, to really provide that kind of excellent employee experience. Again, which is something that more and more people are looking at. So this is where we're speaking around, kind of those assignments and things. So you can have those assignments in groups and devices. We haven't got time to do a full configuration of this today because it will take a couple of minutes for me to move on to the next screen whilst it's kind of loading those. So what I'm going to just do is kind of close that off. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a snapshot overview of what a customer lens looks like from autopilot component. Of course, you can provide this as a service to your customer. So Westcoast can be uploading that information for you, but you can actually do that Intune quick start. So maybe the customer's not using Intune initially. Okay, so potential service options as partners would be, well, let's, do co-management. Okay, remember we spoke about earlier that connection between configuration manager and Intune, and create that kind of co-management setup, and then allowing devices to be ongoingly managed, deployed through autopilot. Once they've been, enrolled and deployed through autopilot, the customer then can continue to manage those in configuration manager if they wanted to. It doesn't need to be an all or nothing. They don't need to move everything over. Okay, they can kind of do that in baby steps. Then what we're going to look at quickly Just in terms of devices, so we've got the multiple different platforms. Remember, we spoke earlier around mobile phones, around that mobile application management. And what I just want to quickly draw your attention to here is this technology which we call conditional access. Okay, and conditional access, it is really one of the main foundations of some of our security stuff that we're kind of leveraging here within Microsoft Intune. Okay, so conditional access, for those that aren't aware, is a technology which is around if this happens, then what are we going to do? Like if then when kind of scenario, if this then that. So as an example that I could see here, so if I was going to create a new policy as an example, we can see, do we want this to apply to users or workloads? So let's just say all the users in this scenario. Okay, it's going to flag a little warning that I would also be impacted in that in case the policy did something and logged me out. Do I want it to apply to certain applications or authentication context? So, cloud apps, authentication, things like that, user actions and stuff as well. So there's various different options that you've got down here. But actually, it's when you get into the conditions. So a common scenario for conditional access could be if you're trying to access this application or this device in a certain location or outside of a certain location, you require multi-factor authentication. Okay, so you can define physical locations, like actual geographical locations, as part of this. So perhaps you've got your standard office environment, and you might say, well, okay, anybody that's logging in to a device within the boundaries of our site, we're not going to ask them to do a multi-factor authentication because we've got, physical access to the building, as an example. Okay, and the chance and likelihood of someone trying to access something within the physical building using the correct credentials is quite unlikely. That maybe that could be a risk scenario, and maybe you don't want to be creating a burden on your employees' time, so you say, well, you don't need to do MFA if you're within the building. Okay, and that would be sitting here. Okay, so you can do that configuration, trusted locations, that could be different IPs and things like that as well. There's various different ways of setting up those trusted locations as well. Yeah, and then you can also, what is the user risk, sign-in risk, and things like that as well. And then from here, you can decide, what do we want to do? So if they're gaining access from outside of that geographical location, what do we want? Grant access, block access, and what are those different things that we need? MFA was the example I just used there, but perhaps it could also be, password change, things like that. Okay, the devices need to be domain joined to be able to access it, as an example. Okay, there's lots of different options and scenarios that we've got within conditional access policy, to be able to really strengthen that kind of security portfolio and posture within those environments as well. And then we're quickly going to have a look onto the applications tab that we've got here as well. Okay, so we can see that we've got our kind of applications overview, right? Because of these devices that I've actually got running our virtual machines in Azure, they don't have a huge amount of applications that are running on those, but it's quite interesting that you can see here in terms of the applications and things that will be demonstrated. And then if we want to add any applications, we can go, well, what is that app name? So as an example, we can go, well, let's say we want all of our devices within the organization to have Microsoft 365. Okay, so, we go in and add that application. So this is how we'd actually push an application out to a device. So this is how easy and straightforward it is to be able to push out applications to devices via Intune versus something like Configuration Manager, which is slightly more complex to be able to do. We've got that kind of component here, like how are we tagging that categorization, so we can kind of monitor that moving forward in terms of reporting. Where are we obtaining those information and those URLs, and also any developer information that we're looking for as well, of course, because it's Microsoft software that we're installing in this scenario, that's kind of pre-populated for you. And then we're looking through, what is actually the configuration that we're going to do on that. Okay, so we've got different options there for the configuration settings. What does that architecture, 6432? Most scenarios it's going to be 62-bit in 64-bit, sorry, in kind of today's modern world. What we're looking at in terms of the channel. Okay, so channel is kind of like the update version, as it were. Okay, so you've got the monthly channel, which is, you know, every year, semi-annual, like every month, sorry, semi-annual, which is twice a year, etc. So channel's kind of, you know, another word for version or update, I suppose, is probably an easy way to be able to reframe that. As part of that, you know, what other formats and things as well. So you can kind of go through this list in terms of those configurations. We've got some elements here potentially that you might see in libraries or education, you know, shared device activation scenario as an example. So you'd go through and you configure these settings as you'd need them. And then on the next screen, let's just quickly click on these. Then on the next screen, you would see the assignment. So do we want to roll that out for all devices? Okay, so, you know, all users, all devices, any groups that we've got. So groups will be linked to your Active Directory as an example. So any kind of distribution groups or groups that you've got added in there within 365, and then your Active Directory would be showing within that component there. And what do we want to assign those to? You know, available for enrolled devices, or do we want to uninstall? Okay, so uninstall is also an option. You would then go through and review and create. And then when those users log in, those devices turn on, you know, that's when you can kind of get those applications that are pushed through. So very, very straightforward in terms of that kind of application deployment. If it's any applications that, you know, you're having to manually upload and things like, you know, you packaging those and, you know, uploading and tagging kind of the location to be able to deploy those. And then the last thing that I'm just going to quickly close off on here is endpoint analytics. And I think a lot of organizations aren't aware about endpoint analytics. So I just want to quickly give you a quick kind of overview on that. So here within the report, we've got this little thing down here, endpoint analytics. Again, because my demo environment is virtual machines, I don't get a huge amount of data to show. However, I can actually show you still the options. So we are greeted here with our endpoint analytics score. So this will collect telemetry from your devices and provide key insights in terms of, you know, application reliability, you know, crashes, startup boot times. Are my devices ready for Windows 11? As an example. Okay, so these are all components that you can actually see as part of endpoint analytics, which is completely included within Intune. You don't need to have additional licensing above Intune licensing to be able to get this reporting as it stands today. So we're looking at the startup performance. Okay, so we can see what, you know, what are boot times, but actually it goes into quite a bit of granular level. Okay, so not only is it, you know, what is our kind of boot time and sign-in time, it's what is our sign-in time to a responsive desktop. Okay, so not just how long does it take me to boot to get to a normal desktop screen, how long does it take me once I get to that desktop screen so I can actually click on something and do some work, because that's a common scenario and challenge. Or perhaps the boot time and the sign-in time, you know, is delayed. It's probably going to be a group policy setting that might be doing that. Okay, and if it is a group policy, if the time for the group policy or script to be run is taking too much time, you can actually go in at a granular level and find out what policy it is that's causing that issue as well. Okay, so these are like the really interesting and key insights that you can have when you're assessing, you know, what is that digital employee experience, user experience within those organizations. This is a service, you know, this is a services opportunity as a partner. You know, you could be coming in here and having a look at this, okay, and thinking, well, how do we structure some form of strategic procurement based on device performance? Okay, going in here and go, well, we know that these devices aren't performing very well, as an example. You know, how do we actually kind of structure in some form of device rollout or refresh based on device performance versus device age? So that's just an example, okay, that you can maybe be leveraging something like this, okay, because we've got, you know, other components here such as, you know, restart. You know, how many times the device is being restarted and why, you know, long button power press as an example. That's kind of not many device telemetry software solutions kind of show this, you know. So how many times is the user forcing a restart? Because if the user's restarted the device, it might actually think, well, that could be for a normal legitimate reason that they've rebooted their device. But if it's long button power press, you know that they've done it because something's wrong, as an example. You know, and then we've got the normal kind of shutdown, etc., etc. And unknown would fall in here, so abnormal shutdown, So that could be power, as an example, could fall in there. So the battery went flat, or there's a power cut, would fall within that particular scenario as well. Okay, and then stop error. So that would traditionally be called like blue screen, as an example. Okay, so you can kind of see these different components here. Again, looking at what is that performance for the device. Then look in terms of the applications themselves. I say probably not going to show me anything thinking about it with not having the thing. So what you would have with the applications, if you can see devices in here, you've got this kind of mean time to failure. So it's what applications have I got within the organization which are crashing or failing? How quickly is that happening? So that's the mean time to failure. How many devices are impacted? And then you can go in again to that kind of granular level around what version of application is it. So maybe you've got a customer that's saying, well, this application keeps crashing, example, or the customer's raising it, to their help desk or something like that, and they go, well, so and so application keeps crashing. Maybe we'll use the example of Adobe because it's a household name. So Adobe keeps crashing. It's causing me a massive time drain. And they're hearing that consistently, but actually it could be that there's 4 different versions of Adobe running because maybe they haven't updated the one that they're running, and it's a particular version which is causing a problem. Okay, you can go in and you can have a look at that, and you can find that through endpoint analytics, because it might not be the application in its entirety. It could just be one particular update version of that application which is causing a problem. You can check on that within here. And then we've got the work from anywhere component. Okay, so you can look at how are we managing these devices. You can kind of drill down. We've got Windows, which is really interesting. So this is where you can get the Windows 11 readiness. So you can actually click on the devices that are visible within here. It will show how many devices meet the requirements or don't meet the requirements for Windows 11. And these little tabs down here, setting components, they will actually highlight why. So it could be 6,000 devices, don't meet hardware requirements because of the TPM, as an example. So that would be highlighted here, as the particular components. TPM is probably the most common one, maybe firmware, that you would find that would kind of cause that challenge. And again, you can kind of have a look on that. Well, what does that Windows 11 migration process look like? What is that kind of journey in terms of that operating system or that platform, for technical readiness, or understanding the customer landscape and their environment. This is a very good starting point that you can provide, particularly for your customers. If as a partner you are you're buying the CSP through Westcoast, but then you've also got delegated admin. If the customer's using this, then with their permission, you can actually go in and have a look at this stuff as well, right? And provide those kind of insights and those recommendations for remediation as well as part of that. So I think actually we're coming up to time now. So I just wanted to take the time to thank everybody for listening to today's session. Please go and have a look at the autopilot recording that we're already going to have uploaded on there for you as well. If you've got any questions, please do reach out to your Westcoast team. They'll be more than happy to address any questions or challenges and concerns in terms of any process. And they've also got, contact and communications with the Microsoft team, if they require any further information to assist you. Thank you.